Why did the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner resign? And what does this tell us about the British Constitution? Was she legally required to resign? Or was some other type of pressure or obligation in operation? Angela Rayner resigned after an investigation by the government's independent ethics advisor found that she had underpaid the stamp duty on her £800,000 flat. Essentially, Angela Rayner has been found to have breached what is known as the Ministerial Code. This is a 38-page guide issued by the Prime Minister which sets out how government ministers should discharge their duties and conduct themselves in office. Importantly, the Ministerial Code is not legally binding. Rather, it is a collection of rules that we call conventions. Conventions in the British Constitution are non-legal rules about how government should be conducted. By non-legal, I mean that they are not enforceable by a court, nor is conduct that breaches a convention illegal. Rather, the adverse consequences of breaching a convention are political rather than legal. For example, we all follow certain rules and practices every day, even if there is no specific law saying that we have to do so. Most of us would not eat soup with our hands, or belch at the dinner table if we're out for a fancy meal with our friends. Most of us usually shower or bathe regularly. And most of us, I hope, would brush our teeth. There are other reasons persuading us to do these things, rather than somebody telling us that it's the law. In the context of the British Constitution, conventions tell public officials how to conduct themselves or how to exercise their lawful powers, even if legally they could exercise them in a different way. So, for example, conventions are fundamentally important to controlling or constraining the monarchy. In theory, King Charles III can refuse to grant royal assent to a bill, effectively vetoing legislation. But imagine the political consequences that would flow from a decision like this if he were to do so. Likewise, the king is legally free to appoint anybody he likes as Prime Minister. But again, what would be the political consequences were he to do so? Parliament and politicians are unlikely to be very happy, to put it mildly. And things have gone very badly in the past when monarchs have come into conflict with Parliament. I'm sure Charles III only has to look at what happened to Charles I to see why this would be a bad idea. I joke, of course, chances are Parliament isn't going to do something as extreme as that today. Conventions are evidence of the faith that the British Constitution places in politics, rather than in law, in constraining the actions of public officials. Instead of tasking courts with policing these rules, the Constitution leaves their enforcement up to politicians who both hold and are held accountable by the people's elected representatives. So circling back to the Ministerial Code, a convention exists that usually a government minister who is found to have breached the Ministerial Code will resign or face being sacked by the Prime Minister. Importantly, it is the Prime Minister's decision to both decide whether the code has been breached and whether the minister should be sacked. On the issue of the first question of whether the code has been breached, usually the Cabinet Office or an independent advisor will be asked to conduct an investigation and make findings, but the decision is still for the Prime Minister to make. Again, this obligation to resign or be sacked is not a legal requirement but a political one. Now, I specifically said that a minister should usually resign or be sacked because in 2020, controversy arose when the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was found to have breached the Ministerial Code after an inquiry found that she had bullied some civil servants. However, Prime Minister Boris Johnson refused to sack her, stating instead that as the arbiter of the code, having considered Sir Alex's advice, the Prime Minister's judgment is that the Ministerial Code was not breached. In protest at this failure to enforce the Ministerial Code, Sir Alex Allen, the independent advisor who wrote the report, resigned instead. Boris Johnson's failure to uphold the Ministerial Code was criticised by commentators as bringing a fundamental part of the British Constitution into disrepute. He has opened up much wider questions about how the government handles bullying complaints and whether the Ministerial Code is fit for purpose as a check on the conduct of actions and ministers. His actions were also described by others as unsurprising, for in his 16 months in office the Prime Minister has shown an obvious disregard for a number of constitutional conventions. Boris Johnson would later face even further criticism when, in the dying days of his premiership, he changed the Ministerial Code by removing the obligation to resign, adding lesser sanctions such as apologising or temporarily losing pay. The background to this was that he himself was under pressure over whether he had breached the Ministerial Code by misleading Parliament over what was known as Partygate. Under Rishi Sunak, some semblance of normality returned, with both Dominic Raab resigning and Nadeem Zahawi being sacked during his premiership for breaches of the Ministerial Code. Angela Rayner's resignation does suggest that the convention that a minister breaching the code should be resigned or sacked is still holding under the Starmer administration. Nevertheless, concerns do still abound about the fact that there exists areas in which the government can write, revise and adjudicate upon its own rules without meaningful external legal control. If conventions are what are known as the morality of the Constitution, it's worthwhile keeping a close eye on their effectiveness when assessing the health of a political and constitutional order. If you found this video helpful, please do press the like button and subscribe to support the channel. Keep a lookout as well for my Coffee Time Constitutional Law series launching soon, which will break down key parts of the British Constitution, with each video lasting no longer than it takes to drink a cup of coffee.